Hello and happy Thanksgiving. At this time of year, we set aside a day that we're supposed to use for reflecting on all the blessings that God has given us and giving thanks to Him for that. But it must be said that right now there are a lot of stresses in our society that may make it hard to feel thankful. We're dealing with inflation. Many people are sick. Many people are out of work. There are political divisions. There are all kinds of things that are happening that just add to our stress level right now and can make it really rather hard to be thankful for all of the many ways God has blessed us. But let me tell you a story. This is a story about a man named Martin Rinkart. Martin Rinkart was born in 1586 in a town called Eilenburg in Saxony in Germany. He grew up in a Lutheran family. His father was a cooper, a barrel maker, and he had the opportunity to attend a school for choristers, essentially musicians, in Leipzig. He went there, was trained as a musician, went on to study theology, and then he returned to his hometown of Eilenburg with the hope of becoming a deacon. Now, he was turned down in that position by the superintendent of the church, ostensibly because he was a better musician than he was a theologian. But actually, I think it had more to do with the fact that Rinkart thought for himself and was a hometown boy, and the superintendent was probably a little bit intimidated by this. One way or another, he went to Eisleben, which is the town Luther was born in, got a job as a musician there, became a deacon there, eventually became a pastor, and then returned back to his hometown of Eilenburg, where he took a position as a pastor there. While doing all of this, he wrote plays, he wrote music, wrote hymns, and so on. So he was working both as a pastor and theologian and as a musician. And then in 1618, the 30 Years' War broke out. Now, we don't know much about the 30 Years' War in America, but what I will tell you is that in Germany, to this day, it's remembered as the most devastating war ever fought on German soil, and that includes World Wars I and II. Now, World War II certainly had a higher death toll, but in terms of percentage of the population, the 30 Years' War was far, far more devastating. And the reason for this is simple. Gunpowder armies were really emerging in this period. And as a result, armies got much larger. And, well, the fact of the matter is you've got 30 years of large gunpowder armies traveling back and forth across Germany, living by plundering. And this kind of thing is going to leave behind an incredible wake of devastation. So that is the context in which Rinkart carries out his most important ministry. He's a pastor, again, in the city of Eilenburg. This was a walled city, which made it a place of refuge. People fleeing, fighting, people fleeing the armies went to these walled cities in the hope of finding protection. Now, unfortunately, what this meant is that the city rapidly became overcrowded and food became scarce. And then in 1637, plague hit the city. The superintendent fled, leaving the remaining pastors to carry out the ministry and to do the funerals. Unfortunately, two of them contracted plague and died as well, leaving Martin Rinkart alone to conduct all of the funerals in the city and to minister to the survivors. He performed up to 50 funerals a day, totaling 4,480, including his wife. And then it became too much. The death toll was simply too high to conduct individual funerals. They began doing mass graves. And in total, 8,000 people in the city of Eilenburg would die of plague that year. After the plague came famine. It was said by people in the city that 30 or 40 people out in the streets would be fighting over a dead rat or a dead crow in an effort to find something to eat. Rinkart mortgaged several years of his income to try to find food, to try to get food for his children and for other people in the city. but nonetheless, starvation was a major problem. And after that, the Swedish army came. The Swedes were involved in the war on the Lutheran side. And when they arrived in 1637 in Eilenburg, they demanded money to pay for the war effort, to pay the soldiers and such. They asked for 30,000 florins, which was a huge sum of money, and Eilenburg simply didn't have it. Martin Rinkart went out to negotiate with the Swedish general. The Swedish general was adamant about the 30,000 florins. Rinkart ended up turning to the people who'd come out of the city with him and said to them, "Come, my children, we can find no hearing, no mercy with men. Let us take refuge with God." And he fell down to his knees and began praying. And he prayed so earnestly that the Swedish general relented and accepted only 2,000 florins rather than 30,000. The war would last another 11 years. And despite everything that Rinkart had done for the town, the leaders were not particularly grateful. They constantly harassed him, frequently about financial matters that were caused by his efforts to feed all the people in the city, the starving people. When peace finally came in 1648, Rinkart, who was by this point prematurely aged and frankly exhausted, only lived another year. He died young in 1649. Why am I telling you this story? Martin Rinkart wrote one of the great Thanksgiving hymns that we still sing to this day, "Now Thank We All Our God." He wrote it as a table prayer to give thanks to God for all of his blessings, and he wrote it in the midst of this war. Similarly, if you look at another of our Thanksgiving hymns, "We Gather Together to Ask the Lord's Blessings," that was written in Dutch during, well, sometimes called the Dutch Revolt or the Dutch War of Independence. The Dutch call it the 80 Years' War. It was written in about 1597, before the 30 Years' War broke out. But it was written in the midst of war again. And while the English words don't really translate the Dutch, if you read them, you can hear the echoes of the war in those words. Now, if Martin Rinkart could write a table prayer thanking God in the midst of the horrors and the disaster of the 30 Years' War, with war, plague, famine, and extortion, frankly, all occurring in 1 year, and thousands of people dying in a city. If he could still thank God in the midst of all of that, if the Dutch could write a great Thanksgiving hymn in the midst of their war, I think it puts the stresses and the problems that we are facing in a better perspective. It's not to say that these aren't real problems. It's not to say that they aren't real stresses. And yet, if Rinkart could write a hymn thanking God in the midst of the 30 Years' War, thanking him in faith for the fact of God's goodness, God's providence, God's care for us, then I think we have all the more reason in our very, very prosperous country to thank God for his many, many blessings that he gives us in this world, and especially for the great blessing of his Son, Jesus Christ, through whom we have salvation, union with him, forgiveness of sins, and untold spiritual blessings in the heavenly places.